The Hero's Journey, a Mindful Accord podcast, with your host, Rich Decker.
Hello, and thank you for taking some of your valuable time to listen to the show. If you enjoy this show and have been inspired by this episode or another episode, I would encourage you to join our Patreon page. For those who are unfamiliar with Patreon, it's a platform that allows artists and content creators to build relationships with their audience, while at the same time earning enough money to keep providing the content. When you join our community, you will gain access to exclusive content such as live guest Q&As, behind the scenes, and other exclusive offers. And you can join for as little as $1 per month. There's a link in the show notes that'll take you directly to our page. My guest for this episode is Beth Martens, who is a business and archetype coach. Beth is a corporate cancer survivor whose calling is a life and death thing. Beth teaches deep divers how to explore the emotional underworld through archetypes, to answer their call to the hero's journey so they can conquer their demons and find the value of their life purpose on Earth. You can visit her website, the link will be in the show notes, to take a free Merpreneur archetype quiz. What is a Merpreneur, you may ask? You'll find out when you listen. Beth, like other cancer survivors, has a different point of view on life than those of us who haven't been that close to death. However, when Beth was at the brink of death, she gained some immense insight that she shares with us in this conversation. This is the hero's journey of Beth Martens. Be inspired. Well, thank you, Beth. Thank you for joining us today on the Hero's Journey, a Mindful Accord podcast.
My pleasure.
Let's start at the beginning of your journey. Can you tell us about your childhood and family, where you grew up? And what's one thing that your parents instilled in you when you were young that got you through some of the really dark times?
Yeah, I was born and raised here on the Canadian prairies, bald-ass prairie, as cold as it gets in the winter and hot and tropical in the summer. I had two sisters. My parents were pretty self-made people by my age of about 7, 8. They put us in a car, shipped us up, the whole family up to a place called Riding Mountain. We camped in the middle of the forest, very, very rustic camping. And they designed and built their business because my father had come to like the end of his rope in terms of working for other people and being out of control of his life and his income. So that was when I was coming into my first memories. That's what was happening. That business went on to become very successful. And through that, in terms of a lesson that they taught me, it's that freedom is possible through hard work. While I didn't totally see that what they were doing was their necessarily soul's calling, they saw it as an opportunity, as a place in the market that they could fit themselves in and that they had skills. So it was more practical, in a sense, like more pragmatic, the decision rather than soul driven like mine are now. But it gave me that seed that you don't have to just accept status quo. And just because the vast majority of people are out there getting jobs and listening to other people tell them what to do, that's not a given. So it served me immeasurably just to be able to consider that possibility that I didn't have to work in that traditional context where you have very little power, very little sense of being able to express yourself and who you are. I've had a few jobs in my lifetime, and I usually get fired from them just because there's this, I've inherited this strong freedom, this sense of being able to see through stuff and not be able to look past it. My first word was no. And so I was, brought up with this very strong will. I was strong-willed, not brought up to have it. I know I was a nemesis to my parents as well. But that's one thing, just about my childhood that I noticed outside of the context of my family's thing. I just noticed how the world is so upside down in pretty much every single way. that things didn't work. Why is the food poisoned? Why is the water poisoned? Why is the air poisoned? Why do people have to slave for money to make a living? Why do people have to be terrified to raise kids because they cost so much? All of that kind of stuff just boiled my blood as a kid. I couldn't look past it like everybody else could. So it's something that kind of fueled me, like there must be a better way. And yes, self-employment was in the right direction, but it taught me to go the distance and see, okay, well, how can we live a life that's actually in accordance with who we are inside, spiritually, physically, whatever that means.
That's an interesting point. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in the United States, it's become one big shopping mall where it's all eating and shopping. And I did this long road trip a couple summers ago. I traveled through 8 different states, and I saw the same thing over and over again. And I in my mind, I thought, if I was an alien and I came here to visit, I would think that all we do is eat and shop. So I think you're right in that regards, that we're missing the mark in some way, right? I mean, the capitalism and all these things has afforded us all these things. And, most of the history, 90% of the population were peasants. And that's not the case now, but it seems like we're still kind of missing the mark a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It's, the whole thing is so artificial. It's really been, I've come to the conclusion, I'll just say it like I see it now, that we are slaves on prison planet. We even go more dramatic and say we've been farmed for our slave labor. And some of us at higher levels than others. Some of us, when I traveled in India, I would watch women in saris crush rocks by the side of the road for their, 2 rupees a day. So that's a more obvious slavery, or the $1 trillion human trafficking industry where they sell mostly children and women into, sex slavery, labor slavery, whatever it is. And so given that I see that now, it's like, how do you move forward with an ideal of freedom, with my highest value of freedom in a slave context? So, that's been the code that I'm trying to crack, to live greater and greater sovereignty, to be able to make more and more of your own decisions within a certain context. The hope is that comes to an end. Maybe that which is enslaving us is going to boil itself to the ground because it's pure evil. But in the meantime, how can we live in a place that's actually connected to our soul, so that we can do the work we came here to do on earth for the soul's sake and still effectively get ahead?
Right. Well, it'll be interesting, with the level of information exchange we have now, and just the fact that we can have this conversation. I don't know how far away Winnipeg is, but I know it's a long ways away that we can do this now. I guess time will tell on how things will turn out. But let's get back to your story. When you were growing up, what was your parents' business, by the way?
Yeah, marketing and communication.
So when you were growing up in that environment, and your parents were starting their business, what were your dreams then? What did you want to be when you were a kid?
That was an interesting question to prepare for. I think there was a time where I wanted to be a dancer, and there was a time, very little girl kind of fantasies. I also had a extended family full of medical professionals, doctors and nurses and all those kind of things. So I entertained the idea of going into medicine. I was doing pre-med at some point. Also was fascinated by the human psyche. So psychology started to draw me. And then I ended up choosing anthropology as a subject in my undergrad degree, because it was the biggest subject I could find that didn't narrow out possibilities. So this was another one of those upside down things that the world is getting you to choose. Are you going to be a this thing or a that thing? Which is a very wrong, very misleading kind of a thing, because we are actually unique, whole, complex, actually intricately complex beings, which I'll say more about. That, nearly losing my life to cancer really taught me that. So if we just have all these categories of things to fit ourselves into, we're inevitably going to leave parts of ourselves out. And that's the name of the game. That's how we are so easily enslaved, is that we're all so split up with our consciousness. We've got this idea that, now I'm in this role as a mom, so I'm being a mom, and then I'm in the roles of a business coach, so I'm business coaching now, and then I'm in this other role as an artist or a musician, and then I'm being this artist and musician. And it leaves us feeling like we're going really in every direction. So that's one of the things that I ended up rebelling against. By choosing anthropology, it was a way to choose something that was so big it could contain me. That there was, because we're so how would you say the word? Like, we're anthrocentric, and we decided that anything to do with humans, or like basically everything, is to do with humans. There's nothing you can't study outside of the context. So that's what I ended up choosing in that direction to go into. And then it narrowed down into looking cross-culturally at different medical systems, different healing systems, which is different from medical, and then different spiritual systems. And that was a massive eye-opener to consider the possibility that there might be something that's not bound in culture and not bound in time, that could be a common thread for humanity when it comes to, now specifically, spirituality, cosmology, the way we see the world, the way we relate to our source, to a god, to, whatever that is for each person. My dream of becoming was really amorphous, actually. And I knew I had freedom on the mind. I knew that working for other people wasn't the best way to go. But I did see my parents' business, because I had worked for them every year since I was 10 years old. For example, every summer I would be working for them. I very early on learned that earning money was a very empowering thing. And when I came out of my degree and I was basically qualified for nothing after having put in all that effort, I had a 4.0 not GPS, how do you say it? GPA. And I won the gold medal in anthropology. Like, for all those accomplishments, I still was not qualified even for a job, right? And so at that point, I saw my parents' business as an opportunity to get me into a place of greater freedom, to take on more responsibility, because there was part of me that was really fighting, just spent my whole childhood fighting against the way that things are in the society, and saw that as an opportunity to get into the, being a grown up, having my own money. I needed something to fuel me, because that was the time when I started traveling to India. I needed something to fuel the economy of that. I had a goal at the time to go and live in India with this white bearded guru on a mountain. So,
who turned out to have a pretty dark side. Is that correct?
Totally. Yeah. That's almost always, it's almost a rule, right? You barely hear of an exception of somebody that got into power like that, whether it was through spirituality or politics or even medicine, all that kind of thing. They all end up with very serious problems. And it's not necessarily just that they're evil. It's that the people are looking for a way to not be empowered, to not see that they're responsible for their own decisions and choices. We want to give it off to government. We want to give it off to, when you get sick, you want your doctor to be responsible, so you can just sit back and do whatever they say and have the best hopes. So that was something that, this guru represented, that deep desire to just to have somebody know all the answers and be able to give me advice at every turn. And then the disillusionment, finding out that he was a sex abuser, a pedophile, possibly a murderer. I can't have no way to prove that, but the stories are there. And it was a great moment when that happened, because I finally resolved that I wasn't going to give my power away anymore. And, again, that theme of freedom or sovereignty, I took it in my own hands. It felt like I learned a lot of good things in that context, just because I studied and I applied it and I did the work. So I was able to take that at that point and make use of it and make my living eventually for a decade that way after I nearly died.
Right. Well, we'll get to that. I wanted to ask you about the anthropology. Do you still study that or follow what's going on? Because I don't know if you heard recently about some of this stuff they've been finding with the ancient DNA, that they're discovering whole populations of humans that were migrating around they didn't even know existed until just recently.
Yeah, I'm not up on it. I apologize. And it wasn't, the ancient civilizations wasn't as big an interest for me, the archaeology, all that kind of stuff. It was part of my education, but not my passion. It was more studying traditional cultures, shamanism, the more esoteric side of culture.
So do you think, looking back with the rebel part of you, do you think you almost took anthropology as kind of being rebellious to a certain degree?
For sure. Yeah. And again, it was just such a big subject that it wasn't going to eliminate big parts of me. If I went into medicine, but then I had no access to the spiritual side, for example. I was just looking for something that was not going to pigeonhole me and put me in a box. It left me like open with with nothing, no employable skills, for example. Also, but
well, that's true. But it's funny about anthropology. I just saw this thing was actually put together by an algorithm, but they ran a series of tests or whatever to see which professions had the least likelihood of being eliminated by algorithms or machines. And anthropology was number one. So it may pay off someday.
Oh, there you go. And I use it every day. And also the big discovery for me that I didn't know was such a big discovery at the time, but now looking back, I can see it. That I was introduced to the work of Carl Jung and the presence of archetypes, which I know we're going to talk about more. So I saw that there was a common thread throughout humanity. Through his eyes, he could show how no matter where you went in the world, you were always going to discover that hero, that warrior, that lover, that it's entirely independent. There is something hardwired about the human psyche, no matter where you were born or at what time you were born. So that's something that I carried with me. It was a big aha that I got it intellectually at that time, and then I will. It became part of me, my blood and my bones through my own personal experiences later on.
Now, when you go into school, how did you end up working for your family's business?
The first thing that I did when I graduated was I went off to Nepal, actually, the country, not India first. I worked with a cultural exchange program called Canadian Crossroads that brings about a third as many to Canada as they send overseas to work and live, and not so much in as an aid, but as somebody who's learning the culture and expanding the horizons and bringing that wisdom back to Canada, for example. So I went off on my first trip to Nepal, and then from there I skipped over to India because I had studied with a teacher in university who lived there, not the guru, but the student of the guru. And I was at that point learning to meditate, learning to get into, because the academics had been very disillusioning. I studied all about these things, but I didn't get enlightened by them. I just got more information. And so then I was hungry to get my hands dirty and actually do this stuff, not just study about it. So I took this meditation course and started getting into the ancient arts and Sanskrit mantras and all of that kind of thing. And that gave me the ability to just see for myself the transformation of consciousness. It's not an academic subject. It's not something you can just think about and read about and get. And I know from your work, you're probably well aware. And right now in this day and age, it's very common for people to have spiritual practices, and there's a yoga center on every corner. But back in that day, it was still considered something very alternative, a little bit of a feeling of a witch hunt when people found out what I was up to, especially when I was in that business world. Having made my first trip overseas and I saw the freedom of it, right? Like for the first time in my life, I was not bound by my parents telling me what to do. I wasn't bound by a school or an institution giving me deadlines, artificial BS deadlines and stuffing me full of what they thought I needed to learn. There I was, off in the world. And I basically just wanted more of that. So that's how I ended up deciding that. Also, I had come to a place in life where having been the rebel all the time, I knew that that was not sustainable. That was not going to go on. It wasn't financially sustainable, and I'd had lots of flack in my life. So I thought this was the responsible thing to do. Also, to get involved with my family's business and be a helper in that way, be a contributor. That was a strong thing. It was the recession of the 90s, and lots of things were changing and falling apart for them. So I went in to champion and be a force for that greater good. So all the things that I thought were right and that I should do is what I was up to there. Did that answer your question?
Sure, but that ultimately led to your having, as you describe it, a double life where you having this one side, the spiritual side that wants to go to India and learn all this else, but the other side is the business side. And that was a lot of conflict internally for you.
Yeah, exactly. I was split, right? So it's a sign of that, where by day I was wearing a suit and had the title of vice president and was working with corporate clients from all over the world and showing up. We gave very large events. I was doing publicity and event management and all that kind of stuff by day. And then every spare moment, weekends, evenings, I was hosting workshops, I was teaching, I was bringing teachers in from various places in the world to do events. I was playing music, I was writing songs, I was recording, all that kind of thing. So there was the two worlds really did not meet. There was one time that I was working in my office in the daytime, and I got a reporter on the phone. We were doing publicity for one of our clients. And he goes, "By the way, Beth, I know what you're up to." And I'm just like, oh my God, I've been found out, that they're going to notice that I'm actually a total flake and never take me seriously again in the business world. And luckily, this reporter had an interest, was intrigued by the whole spiritual side of things that I was up to. So I wasn't busted. But there was that feeling that I would be busted. In the spiritual world, it wasn't cool to be into business, right? That was a knock against me. So I had to hide my spiritual life from the business people. I had to hide my business life from the spiritual people. And it created this divide. And like you said, total inner conflict.
Well, how does one, I don't know where we're headed, right? Nobody does, but how does one incorporate both those sides into one? I mean, there has to be a reason. I read something that you wrote where, your business or what you're doing professionally can also be a part of your spiritual journey as well. And I definitely see that because especially when you're starting your own thing, man, there's a lot of trials and tribulations, and you're going to rely on your spirituality a lot. But how do you see combining those two?
Yeah, today I can't see not combining them. Once you've broken that fracture, it's even hard to imagine how could I have been so split, because honestly, all of those realities of that I had to hide from the two sides of my lives, it was all manufactured in my own head. If I had stepped out and said, like, this is who I am, and really stood up for it, just called it and said, here's what I'm going to do with it. And I don't care if anybody likes it, and I don't care if anybody doesn't like it. So that's where I'm coming from today when I look at somebody. And this is the very common problem that I solve for my clients when they come through the door, is they feel split into all of their different passions, skills, trainings, talents, interests, everything, experience that has taught them. They feel like they're like a many-headed dragon, is the way that I describe it, going in various directions. And they often end up, when they build businesses, they build them with multiple components and a lot of different kinds of services. It's not as big a problem for men, for example, because men aren't as easily lured into multi-passions. They have that ability to be able to focus down And that's been considered a disability in women, that they can't do that, that they allow their interests to go in many directions. But if you turn those arrows around, instead of having them go out and you have them go in, and you let yourself be the source of it, you let yourself be utterly unique, because we are, total cliche, but we're like snowflakes. Every person is different. You could take a person with the identical training to somebody, but because of their background, their experience, what they've overcome in their life, you could never have an identical business. So that's what I help to create, is that one of a kind service that's sourced in your own soul, in your own being. And it really solves the multiple personality thing, because you turn it around from defining, this is one of the ways that we have been split and remain split, that serves not us, that we're defining ourselves by the things that we use to get people tools, right? So, for example, when you say a psychologist or a massage therapist, when they're doing their craft in that more conventional way, traditional way, then the psychologist is going to use all the psychology tools and calls themselves a psychologist, which is really indicative of their tools. The massage therapist, their tool is body work, and therefore they identify and call themselves that, and then they feel like that. But in reality, because of all of their experience and all of the other things in their life that make them a whole person, if they were to turn that around and define it based on results that they can create in somebody's life, and the tools are actually not unimportant, but they're somewhat incidental, because the moment you find a better tool, your old tool might be out the window, if the purpose is really helping people. So by turning into this, like, identity is so important. If we feel like a psychologist, then we're a psychologist, and we're not everything else, right? Like we're literally blind to it. We become unconscious to it. And what we're unconscious to becomes a source of draining our energy, rather than something that contributes to us. Again, the arrows pointing away, all our life energy is pointing out of us, and it results in a net loss of energy. So, like, wholeness is nature's way. And when you clear all the junk and the fractures, and let go of those identities that keep us locked in identification with the things that are not even actually real, they're probably just somebody's creation in their basement. They came up with this tool or that tool. Lots of evidence for that. Then we're in a totally different position to be able to offer other people help, and to live as one being that doesn't leak energy all day long. And that's kind of the key.
Well, it's interesting. You say that nature is wholeness, but I often think that nature is balance, and we live our lives, many of us, much of the time, out of balance in one way or another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is that what you help people find, is balance?
Yeah, I have a little rebel's take on the word balance, because balance is actually the very thing that we are seduced to seek, because we're split up into pieces. And that means that our pieces collide with each other and oppose one another, and that we need to balance, because you don't need balance if you don't have opposing forces. So, for example, it's the very common thing, balance your personal life and your professional life. Well, what if you didn't have this idea that those two things are separate and opposed to each other? Then you would never need to balance one against the other. You would just be part of your wholeness, and you wouldn't be obsessed with trying to draw the lines and create this to be separate from that. Like, one thing is that people draw the line between personal and professional because often they hate their professional life, or it's something, it's just a means to an end. It's something that they do due diligence, that because they have to, right? So what if those worlds weren't separate? What if the personal life and the professional life actually had a place to meet in something that was really in alignment with who you are? You didn't lose energy to it, right? So that's my take on balance.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that, because Again, the illusion that everything's separate, that's a very strong illusion, but in reality, everything's interconnected. So there is no separate business life or home life. I mean, it's just, there's all one. It's all one thing.
Exactly. Exactly. You got it. You got it. But we're trained at the level of the psyche.
When did your health begin to take a turn, and when did you know that something was wrong with you?
Yeah, I was in business with my family's firm for, I think, since the time I graduated at 19, I believe. So I was with them for 6 years while I was traveling back and forth to India every year. My dad gave me 6 weeks of paid holiday to go and continue that habit, knowing that, he needed to foster my interest as well as the business life. And on my last trip to India, my last trip away from that, the holiday, so to speak, from the business, I was very, very sick with a flu, and I found a great big lump in my neck. So it was really the trip to end all trips. I never have been back to India yet since then, and probably will not go back. I really don't see it. I don't have the desire for it. When I got back, it took me a number of months to get diagnosed for one reason or another. Our system was already ailing. It was hard to find a doctor. I had resistance to the medical system big time. As an authority, that I learned all this about different healing systems and knew that medical Western intelligence was not the only way to go by any means. And so there were a number of months, but I walked into the surgeon's office after I had had my biopsy, and I was actually fully expecting to get you're fine, go home. You're just making up symptoms. Because I was sick at that point. I was having a hard time getting my energy. I was literally banging my head against the shower wall every morning. In fact, wondering how I could get out of this because I felt unable to leave. Such a strong sense of loyalty to my family's business. And so I went to the surgeon's office. He told me I had a stage 4 lymphoma, and my jaw hung open. And I'm like, okay, I wasn't just making things up here. And I didn't realize, I left my office for the last time ever. I never, ever went back to it. I went to the river. I sat there and, just holy crap, what's happening here? And made a plan for healing in a number of different ways. It was a 3-year journey for me. So it was no fast in and out. The Hodgkin's lymphoma actually has a really good prognosis. The first time you're diagnosed, they consider that 80% of the people are going to live, even though it was a stage 4 lymphoma. And it wasn't until I was diagnosed a second time that I was told I was not going to survive. So over the course of the 3 years, I really fought for my life. And even though I tried to avoid all the Western medicine, I actually ended up doing it all, months and months and months of chemotherapy and surgeries and stuff like that, as well as all the natural things. In my circumstances, I couldn't go full tilt with the natural beyond the 50 grand that I invested in begging, borrowing, and stealing, and I still wasn't recovered. So that's how that ball rolled.
When you first heard you have cancer, what was the first thought that went through your head?
The first thought was, I'm not going back to work. Because I was having so much conflict with it already. I was suffering. I was struggling every morning to go to work. It seemed pointless. I was working for clients that were, they're multinationals. They don't need anything. They have like ruthless tactics, and their products are not helping anybody, or maybe they're even harming, and often harming, right? None of it made sense. It was so out of alignment for me on a values level that I was unconsciously looking for a way out, right? This is like, not, I don't recommend this. That I actually unconsciously invented being so sick that I had to turn away. And it was just like, okay, I couldn't do it with any happiness to say I'm not going back to work. That would have been different if I'd made the choice as a healthy person and just made an empowered decision, like, yeah, that I can't do this anymore, and I'm going to pursue my own thing. So in this case, it was just like, okay, I guess that's decided for me now.
Where do you think your cancer came from? Did you create it, or do you have any idea? Because you were young, right? 29?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I do believe I unconsciously created it. I know that when I was growing up and surrounded by medical professionals in my family, there was a lot of talk about cancer. And that's something that in that day, there may not have been. I may not have known about it. Like today, it's on every street corner. Yesterday, just as a quick aside, we get a mailing from Cancer Care, and it was the most expensive mailing ever. From a marketing perspective, I know that sending this out, it probably cost $5 plus shipping to send this out to everybody between the ages of 18 and 40, I believe, in this province. Like a disgusting amount of money went into this fishing for cancer patients. You know, it's something that was implanted in my head as a very evil thing. I was afraid of it. So, you know, hearing about it as a child, it scared me. So I do believe that was the seed of the cancer, that I got that fear in me. I had no way to deal with that fear, talking about it to anybody. You know, in general, people deal with their fears by turning a TV on or looking away or pretending that question wasn't asked. That, you know, that was a more common way. And so I think I went forward in my life with some kind of a blueprint for that. You know, again, that unconscious decision of something needs to give, something needs to change, but I'm not empowered to change it. Therefore, I will create circumstances where I have to change. That's how it rolls when people decide that they can't take action. You know, and I also have to speak to a number of other factors that we have not going for us. Again, poison food, poison water, EMFs, you know, you name it. We've got stuff like I finally conclude they're actually trying to kill us. At that point, it was just like, oh my God, there's so many dangerous things. There's fluoride in the water. There's, you know, like you name it, you turn around, car exhaust or whatever. There was so many knocks against the immune system, and my cancer was a disease of the immune system, right? So that was really intensely studying, okay, who's to blame for this? And I came up with a lot of answers of who's to blame, but it didn't help me one bit, because when I asked the question in a more intelligent way, who's responsible for this situation, all I could come up with is myself. I was the only one that was able to actually respond to it. So I had to give up the blame game, the luxury of the blame game.
Empower yourself in that decision. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Take it in my own hands. That it was the big wake up call that I was not taking things in my own hands, not being responsible for myself.
When was the low point? I know at one point you accepted that, you know, this is it. This is the end for me. Was that the low point for you?
For sure, there were many low points over 3 years, but there was a time when I was going through my first rounds of chemo. It had been 11 months of chemotherapy, very aggressive. It's interesting because the less sick you are by their standards and protocols, the more chemo they'll throw at you because they figure that you can take it. And so they just threw the book at me, and I was nearly dead. You know, like I went systematically from being a relatively healthy person who could walk around and take care of themselves and do things for themselves and, you know, still be out and about doing my own shopping and all that kind of stuff, to a person who could not walk a single block. I, you know, made it to this day, and I actually couldn't get out of bed anymore. I couldn't even sit up. That was my last vestige of having some kind of hope or, you know, even self-esteem, was in this ability to sit up, to raise my body and, you know, breathe and all that kind of thing. And I just kind of felt like, wow, I think this is it. I had lost everything at that point. I had sold my house to try to get out of debt to the medical bills. And that was all I got out of it, was paying down those bills. I lost my car. I lost my cats. I let all my things go. I was living in my parents' book room. You know, I'd lost my career, but I also decided I'm not going to go back to that career. It was just literally, I felt like I was left with nothing. In that nothingness, what I finally did in that moment was to stop fighting it and just fully surrender. Like, okay, I lost everything. Now I'm losing my life. I'm going to lose my body. And I just let go. I just like allowed it to happen. And the most miraculous thing came of that, with nothing, as nothing and nobody, I saw who I really am underneath all of that. I saw that I'm totally complete. I'm utterly, the word effulgent, just, self-lighting, nothing missing. The most stark quality of all was joy. There's incredible joy that was at the core of my being. And especially seeing it in the face of having lost everything, like how unusual is that? You think there's nothing but misery in all of that loss. And so having saw this, I also saw that we come to Earth with a specific reason and a specific purpose that really doesn't add up to one thing. It adds up to a life with very common threads that run through it, and that we came to serve certain kinds of people. It's not just about ourselves and what we do. It's how do we fit in with the fabric of humanity? How do we contribute to the greater good? And the last thing I saw is that we don't get out of it. So even if my body was to pass in that moment, if I was to take a last breath, I would just have to come back again on that mission. Right. So I saw the blueprint or DNA of my life, and I saw that it persists whether I lived or died. And so having seen all of that, I immediately went into remission. Like I actually began to recover from cancer, and I was diagnosed to be free from cancer very shortly after that. Because I got to a place of being able to really feel what cancer feels like, and to feel what the sickness of chemotherapy felt like. And I could no longer sense cancer in my body. So I asked for a test, and it was verified that I was clear.
How long did it take?
After that experience that I was describing, how long did it take before I got those results? Maybe a couple of weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So things turned around very fast, right? Just from seeing who I am. What kind of magic is that, right?
What did the doctors think? What did they say? They had to have like, what? what?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a circus in there. They don't know anything. They really don't know anything. I ended up challenging every one of their tests. By the end, I was getting no tests because they actually couldn't really even justify my treatments were actually never based on tests ever. This was something I was really mad about towards the end, finding this out, that they were, giving me chemo based on my weight. And they blew a hole in my sacrum to get a bone sample. They took blood out of me, those vampires, on a regular basis. All kinds of like inhumane tests I had to suffer through. And then the treatments based on my weight. The relationship to the medical authority was really tenuous. Now, I went on without cancer, but there was like, for example, the recovery from the chemotherapy was long, slow, and intense, right? Because they nearly kill you. And it's part of the strategy to nearly kill you, because they're considering that that's how much cancer is dying too, and the hope that you can restore and regenerate. And so within 18 months after going into remission, I was diagnosed a second time. I knew I was sick again. I could sense it was definitely the cancer was back. And that's when they wanted to throw the book at me. I went into daily chemotherapy. They offered me a stem cell transplant as my only chance to survive it. And at that point, I was again going like, I think, and I'd been through such a healing at that point, through so much transformation, and somehow felt like the spirit had healed of what was ailing it. When they offered me the stem cell transplant, and I learned that half the people die doing a stem cell transplant, I thought, you know what? I just don't want to die that way. And that's not a good enough number to half a chance. You go through a year of very intense treatments, a lot of isolation because you have no immune system. You can't withstand anything. I watched my brother-in-law die that way of a stem cell transplant, and it's horrendous. So it was at that moment that was such a crossroads for me. I went home after kind of a big fight, that doctors are trying to scare me, you're going to die and all this kind of stuff. And I just went inside myself. And it was at that point that I discovered Archetypes, because there was one of my favorite authors, Carolyn Myss, had just published a book called Sacred Contracts. And I didn't even know, I wasn't thinking archetypes, even though I'd studied it in university. But when I got her book and I read it, I knew that somehow this held the keys for me to at least decide whether to do a stem cell transplant or not. And I very quickly was able to take, what was really deeply unconscious in me. And at the time, really, it was that inner fighter, that inner rebel. I refer to it as Mer these days, Mer or Merpreneur, which we'll talk about, I believe, later. And so by awakening this part of myself, I gained energy, right? That was the big discovery. Now I can describe it. Then I couldn't describe why it was working. I just knew it was working. But I was taking the energy that I was using to suppress really important parts of myself and just letting it up. So when I didn't use that energy to suppress anymore, it turned into a very healing force. And that was the time I went into remission again, and I never had to look back. I was healed. All of my suspicions that the job was done was true. The doctors did not know what to make of me. They didn't care. I actually was hired as a musician. About 6 months later, I was in the very same chemo ward where I had been receiving treatments, playing my guitar to other people who were receiving their treatments so that they could have a less crappy day. And my oncologist went walking right by me, and I'm like, oh, he didn't see me. I'm going to go and say hi. And it was like, hey, I didn't die. I told him, totally awkward moment like this. And he's going like, yeah, I got to go. I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. This guy doesn't even want to say, wow, I'm happy for you, or good for you, or how did you do it? None of that stuff, right? So it just let me see how bleak it really is in what they're doing for people. But that's how the whole story rolled.
The second time you didn't get any kind of treatments, is that what you're saying?
No, the second time I went into very aggressive, immediate treatments, daily chemotherapy. So like, very, more aggressive than ever.
Okay.
Yeah, more aggressive than ever. It's last ditch effort. They feel like you're going to die, so they're just doing anything possible to give you the chance to live, supposedly.
How much of a part do you think the chemo played in your healing, or do you think it was more your emotional?
It's all of it, right? Like coming to that place now of seeing everything as a whole, it's all of it. I have no way to say. I could see that chemo worked at a certain level because, yes, it does kill cancer. Yes, it does. It kills everything. It's a very blunt instrument, ridiculously blunt instrument. But I could tell what pain and sickness to cancer was, and I could see that chemo would reduce it. So that's, it's not like it's completely wrong. There was a naturopath I moved to Vancouver to work with at one point, and he wished he could use chemotherapy because he knew that it does play a part if you could use all of the natural stuff plus some of the conventional tools. Then yeah, whatever works, right? It's not like you've got one side against the other side. So everything contributed.
Even though, chemo is helpful, I think someday it'll be looked upon as very barbaric.
Yes, exactly. And the fact was that I had, for 3 years, had been doing everything and not recovering and losing my life, right? So that's why I credit Archetypes to saving my life, because it was the one new thing that I added that was palpable in terms of the energy reclamation. Like, that is the whole theme of all of my work right now, that if we can reclaim energy from the unconscious, then we have free energy. And what does free energy do? I don't know how to heal from cancer, but free energy does. If that's actually the path of the soul, because everybody dies at some point. I had to be really go into very deep peace with dying, whether it was going to be this week, next week, or 30 years. I didn't know, but all of that lets up that unconscious fear that we're not going to survive. That's really the core of why we keep things so locked down in our psyche, is that we don't want to feel that basic fear of dying and some of those other core fears that we're just simply not taught to deal with in the society.
So let's get to the archetype thing. If I've never heard the word before, how would you describe it to me? What is it? Where does it come from? Why has it worked so well for you and others?
Yeah, the easiest explanation is that we're almost all familiar with the DNA, what the role that our DNA plays in each individual cell. It tells the cell what to be. It tells the cell whether it's going to be a skin cell or a heart cell or a hair cell, and what function it's going to play, and then it just does that. So it's kind of like a hard wiring. So the archetypes are like I consider them to be a spiritual and emotional DNA, and this comes from Carolyn Myss as well. that she put it across that way. So it's a kind of very understandable or approachable definition. And it's really the explanation about why people are inclined in the way that they are, why they are different, where they are the same. From Carl Jung, I know also that it's representing collective consciousness. So it's the place that the human psyche is actually all connected through all time, through all people. It's the reason that you can take two twins, identical twins with the very same upbringing as one another, and they end up with totally different personalities, right? So at the surface level, the archetypes are personality, but at the depths of it, it's soul's purpose. So you can take it very surface, and you can also take it very, very deep. So the work of archetypes is very fascinating. It's actually because it's an antidote to the way that we are all cut up and fractured up. And interestingly, it's almost like doing more fracturing and more cutting up, like breaking parts of yourself out. Even though I was a whole being, I discovered this rebel archetype about myself, which I'd never seen before. Amazingly, right? We're so blind to our own inner workings. For the most part, we're just not taught to look in that way. Even though I'd been meditating for years already, but I just wasn't seeing it. And so we need to break it out in order to see, break out and simplify, really, because the complexity is staggering. That's what I saw from my deathbed. Incredible complexity at the level of the soul. But in order to start understanding, okay, where am I losing energy? Where am I losing my life? Where am I blocked with having self-worth and value in this world? Then by splitting it out and going, okay, what archetype is out of alignment here? What part of your blueprint isn't functioning, isn't giving birth? For example, if we talk about a skin cell, it's not giving birth to a healthy cell, it's giving birth to some kind of a cancer cell that's growing, instead of life, it's growing death. So that's a definition, of an archetype that's in its awakened place, is that it's life-giving and life-supportive, and it connects you to other people. It gives you a sense of personal power that's beyond your own individual self. And then when it's in the unconscious, it is a force of, like, it can be reckoned with like a force of a demon, or some kind of like surprises that we don't want to have happen in our life, and bad circumstances that come about, such as me being as sick as I was. So that's basically the 101 of archetypes.
So where do they come from? And I have a question for you. It's just something I've been thinking about, because I've just been studying this ancient DNA stuff that they've been discovering. So, before there were humans or Homo sapiens, the beings or animals we evolved from, did they have archetypes? And where did the archetypes come from? And how does one discover what their archetype is?
The second question, really easy to answer, but where did archetypes come from? Who the heck knows, right? Like it is, again, through time and through space. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. The human psyche is built out of archetypes. It doesn't matter if you've never heard that word or never worked with them, you got them. Very clearly self-expressed people, even, again, that have never heard of archetypes, will express beautifully through their archetypes. Like there's such a clear, easy to read profile when I meet those kind of people. It's really a beautiful thing. When people are very like vague and unself-actualized and have not taken action in their life or taken any risks or got out to really discover who they are, they're not going to express clearly through the archetypes, and they're not easy to read. So That's now when it comes down to seeing them, we've got the forefathers such as Carl Jung, in more contemporary, Carolyn Myss and Carol Pearson are my favorite archetype authors. I've mostly done this study inward. That's always been my way to get it down what's happening inside my own being first. And then I go out and start to look at the literature and see, okay, how does this measure up? How does it compare? Am I finding the same things that they're finding? And that's almost always the case, which is a very beautiful thing, that I can discover I can discover truth inside myself first and then go to the academic stuff. Because, if we just are pushing furniture around in our heads, it doesn't really add up to much of a hill of beans. But so thanks to the work of all those forebearers then, or forefathers and mothers, or whatever the word is there, we can, I even made it simpler. For example, Carolyn Myss's work, you just have to really slog it through with her book. I created assessments and questionnaires that can help, so that you don't have to sit there and go inward so deeply. It took me every day for 90 days, I was going in, just trying to save my life and see what the heck was going on inside my own psyche. And now I can just have a client come out and fill out questionnaires and discover their archetypes, because I've learned to read them in myself and others. So that's how it comes down to. Every time on the internet, if you see a personality quiz of some kind, it's all about archetypes. They're not saying that word necessarily because they don't want anyone to get confused and run away. Business is all over archetypes. That's they've been harnessing the energy and unfortunately manipulating the heck out of people through those archetypes, because that's something that is it's so powerful. It's already embedded in our consciousness. If you look at an example like Nike, for example, very centered on the warrior archetype, and we all have that at some level. Some of us are very close to the warrior and some of us are farther away from it, but we all have it regardless. And so they literally park in our own psyches with their brand, right? A message, just do it. It all lands in that exact place where we're wired for warrior perception, warrior action, warrior ways of feeling and being. And then we just buy their stuff, or, Apple, we just sit on their doorstep waiting for the next morsel that they put out. I hope that's changing now. So archetypes have been used for many, many years on us. And now this is a chance to turn around and use them on yourself for good rather than just manipulating people.
Getting back to the pre-humans or the pre-Homo sapiens, do you think they had archetypes as well? I mean, it's almost an impossible question to answer, but I'm curious about that.
I think as soon as there was story, as soon as there was some kind of language, whether that was pictorial or language as we know it today, I think that's when archetypes would have been born around the same time. You can't have story without archetypes, and you can't have archetypes without there being a story.
So during the cognitive revolution around 70,000 years ago, that's probably where archetypes developed.
That would be my guess.
What's the difference between the archetypes and enneagrams? I'm more familiar with enneagrams than I am archetypes, even though my degree was in psychology. But what's the difference between those two schools of thought, or those two areas? Or are they similar, just different names?
Yeah, they're actually the same thing. And I haven't studied the Enneagram much. My family has, and they kept trying to type me and they couldn't for some reason. But yeah, so the Enneagram, one of the things that I teach in my business to people that are building their own businesses is how to build signature systems, right? So you take something that's already in existence, like archetypes, and the person who created the Enneagrams, I don't even know who that is, but they created their own system as they saw it through their eyes. And it did resonate with a lot of people through time. Like yesterday, I just had somebody say, "Hey, have you done this Enneagram thing?" And, so it's persisted as a system. That means a lot of people have got results and been able to relate with it and make changes in their life, and that there's something good about it. Now, someone could come along and create a system that's even more sophisticated as a tool to be able to make transformation in life. And that will be their contribution to humanity to expand, not expand on the Enneagram, but to come up with their own way to view life and to again, the ultimate result is reclaiming energy from the unconscious. It's so costly to live unconsciously.
So when you started getting better, you started healing again. Did you decide that I'm going to take this Enneagram, or not the Enneagram, pardon me, archetypes, and I'm going to get back into business, but I'm going to combine the two, and like we talked about in the beginning, where you combine the spiritual side of us along with the business side of us? Is that the idea of starting the Merpreneur?
Yes, exactly. It took me a number of years because I rejected business at first. I really went into a place of, it was one of my grievances. Oh, like this cold, hard, awful corporate business world was evil, and I just wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't even want to be identified with respect to business, but it was really funny. So I went off and did the spiritual arts and music and taught yoga and did workshops and did start to teach about archetypes and that kind of thing. And I just remember how often somebody would say, "Oh my God, Beth, you are so good at," and I'd be waiting for them to say, "You're such a good teacher. You're such a good singer. You're such a good," all these other things I wanted to be identified by. And they'd just go, "You're so good at marketing." And I'm like, "Oh my God." It's the last thing I wanted to hear, because I'm like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to not be about business right now. So I kept hearing this, and I kept also seeing how disempowered people were coming to me, especially women, when it came to finances and their businesses. And I was attracting the entrepreneurs just because that I was born and raised that way. It was in my blood. And there came a point where I just decided to do the work in myself to get past all of my blocks against business and to actually embrace, because, I worked all my life in that world. I had a lot of experience. I'd been a vice president. I reclaimed that part of myself. So it was another level of reclamation of something that I had stuffed down in a way and called bad about myself, and then began to retrain myself in different business systems, because I couldn't relate to the one that I had been taught. It was just all this buy now and I'm better than you are, and really big competition model. It didn't feel right. It didn't seem right. Didn't seem like nature to me. So I retrained in systems that are more about creating one of a kind business and pretty girly stuff in terms of cooperation. Like, we're all in this together. How do we contribute to humanity so that we can take something away from it? So yeah, bringing, and then definitely marrying the nuts and bolts, how to step-by-step things about business with our own spiritual evolution. That is what we're actually here to do on this planet, not just run from fear all day long that we're not going to survive. So this, growth and development of the soul running parallel to the nuts and bolts of building a business. But I don't help people to build to sell widgets or to do things that are just for the sake of making money. But it's really about those ones that can't live without doing their soul's purpose. Like I was, right? That was literally killing me.
The client you're looking for is someone that wants to combine those two areas of their life.
Yeah. And it's usually that they can't not. It's some kind of, they're either headed for a crisis or they already had the crisis, whether it's the car accident or they got sick or the marriage fell apart, or, maybe from the outside, you look at their lives and everything's actually quite perfect. They don't have really big problems. They might, through other people's eyes, feel like they've got everything together with a family and money and, things that you normally consider to be a good life. But inside of them is busting something out that keeps them up at night. And they actually can't psychically and spiritually survive.
So it's the hero's journey, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. It's pushing them to a new level. One of my favorite clients, I just keep watching her be a rock star. She didn't have to do what she's doing. She was taking care of coming from a wealthy family, having a wealthy husband, great kids, and already a good career. But it wasn't bang on in alignment with her soul, and she couldn't stand it. She's one of the bravest people I know because she didn't even have to do it. There was nothing forcing her except her own soul, and she followed her own soul.
And I think it's important to note to people that haven't done this, whether you have money or not, starting your own business or your own solopreneur is always difficult. It's a challenge.
Yeah, freedom has a price, actually, and it's work.
Yeah, it's work. It's nothing. There is no overnight successes. I don't care what anybody says. There's no overnight successes. It's years in the making.
Yeah, my favorite quote is, "It takes 25 years to make an overnight success."
Yeah, right. That's for sure. I'm learning that the hard way, as everybody does. How can we find out more about you, and what do you feel is your purpose, or where do you see yourself in 5-10 years? You think you'll be morphing into something else, or what do you see for yourself?
Oh, it's a fascinating question, especially right now. So much has changed. I lost both of my parents in the last couple of years, and it really turns you inside out. If I look back to answer that question, I've noticed there's been nothing but constant change and evolution. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that continues to happen. And that can be really confusing for people when they think about their soul's purpose, because it's like a noun and we're looking for a thing, and that you got to do your thing. And this is a very big misunderstanding. It's like, no, there's threads of energy through the archetypes that want to express, but they can express in a number of different ways, and you're not limited. Right now, it's a pretty open place. Like, I'm going to definitely continue to support women entrepreneurs who want their freedom through being in alignment with their soul and actually being valued for who they are and their contribution that they make. Like that does seem to be such a common thread and passion for me, and it's going to show up in the world some way. I just recently attracted a mentor, somebody who, mentors you can't hire. They choose you. So somebody who's extremely successful, has 3 businesses and wrote 5 books and multi-millions to his name, chose to work with me. So something really interesting is going to come up of that. We're working on what those goals would be, helping people to transition into a world. We're waking up to the way that the world is out there right now. And that's a really big deal, seeing how many things that are not in our favor, and how do we navigate? How do we start to build tighter communities and more life supportive systems for ourselves, rather than waiting for somebody to do it outside of ourselves that actually doesn't have our good interest at all. But, archetypes are something that the moment that I turned my own life around with a single archetype, I remain very loyal to that process. So if anyone would like to come and have their archetypes read, if you are that type of person that wants to serve with your life's work, you have that idea that you really have to help, and you're gifted, but you haven't been able to put that really into a place of value for others, then you're welcome to join me at my website for a free Merpreneur archetype quiz. It just takes 5 minutes to fill out the questions, and you'll discover where you are on the Merpreneur's journey, which is the hero's journey with a mermaid twist.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Beth. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great story, and what you've gone through and what you're doing now. It gives me hope because, you get sometimes life throws you some curveballs here and there. And, you just, especially if from someone like yourself, that's at that point of there's, this is it. Or someone like Viktor Frankl that's lived through 3 concentration camps. My problems are very small. Most of our problems are very small, but you just certainly are an inspiration.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad. That's. I feel like at the end of the day, if I've done that, then my job is done.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again for listening. And please leave any comments or suggestions. We're always looking for ways to improve our show and make it the best show it can possibly be. Visit mindfulaccord.com, where you can find additional episodes and you can follow our blog. We give some helpful information on mindfulness, meditation, and just ways to manage our everyday stressful lives. And most importantly, if you know of a friend or a family member that would benefit from this story, please share it with them. Until next time, I'm Rich Decker.